Good afternoon. Welcome to the CHIP Landmark Ideas Seminar. Today we'll be hearing about the computational future and biomedicine with Stephen Wolfram, founder and CEO of Wolfram Research. This is the CHIP Landmark Ideas Series, brought to you by the Computational Health Informatics Program at Boston Children's Hospital. CHIP, founded in 1994, it's a multidisciplinary applied research and education program. We're at www.chip.org. We have about 30 faculty working across the spectrum of biomedical informatics, from the molecular characterization of the patient all the way up to care system redesign. We have openings in postdocs, software developers, and we have an ongoing faculty search. So please feel free to be in touch. The Landmark Idea Series is an event series that features thought leaders across healthcare, informatics, IT, science, and more. Our speaker today, who many of you I'm sure are familiar with, is the one and only Stephen Wolfram, the creator of Mathematica, Wolfram Alpha, and the Wolfram Language, the author of A New Kind of Science, the originator of the Wolfram Physics Project, and the founder and CEO of Wolfram Research. Over the course of more than 4 decades, he's been a pioneer in the development and application of computational thinking, and has been responsible for many discoveries, inventions, and innovations in science, technology, and business. Dr. Wolfram will speak about the computational future and biomedicine. We're going to, as we finish up this introduction, we're going to now go into Dr. Wolfram's talk. We'll have a Q&A session at the end. Please put your questions, and you can put them in as we go, as you enter them into the Q&A box. Best to put them there rather than the comment box. If you can remember, we'll look in the comment box if you happen to put them there as well, but please use the Q&A box. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Stephen Wolfram.
Hi there. Well, thanks for inviting me to this. This is not my usual kind of area to talk about. I should say that I live in the Boston area. All 4 of my children have been satisfied customers of Children's Hospital, so thank you for that. What I'm going to talk about both some very practical things and some very conceptual and theoretical things. And the big story is about this paradigm of computation, which I think is sort of the dominant intellectual and practical paradigm of the 21st century. And I'm going to talk about kind of what I see as being some of the potential directions for that paradigm and their implications for biomedical kinds of things. And I guess I'll focus on 2 things. One is computational language, what that is, what it means, what its implications are. It's something I've been working on for the past 40 years or so, so I think it's a pretty important thing. And the other is understanding the computational universe, understanding what's possible in theory with computation and what the implications are for thinking about biomedical kinds of questions that way. I should emphasize that I am very much an outsider in the field of biomedicine. The tools that we've built are pretty widely used for research, data analysis, modeling, and so on, and some production kinds of purposes in biomedicine. But I myself am kind of an outsider looking into this field. Well, okay, maybe I should start with some kind of the big picture is kind of how can computation interact with biomedicine. And maybe I should start with showing some sort of drive-by examples of that. So this is Wolfram Alpha, which some of you hope, well, your average high school or college kid will certainly have seen this. This is Wolfram Alpha exists as a website and many other things. It powers kind of the more serious kinds of computational knowledge questions of Siri and things like that. But the basic idea is you type in a question and it will try and compute the answer. So let's say I do some mathy kind of thing. Let's say I say, what's the integral of x times sine cubed x? So what it will try to do, let me try and make this larger. Yeah, what it will try to do is tell me what's the answer. It will then tell me other sorts of information that it thinks I might find useful. And what it's doing in all cases is it's computing these answers. So it hasn't stored this. It's not going and searching the web. It's computing this. Every time somebody asks a question, it's computing the answer to that question. So there are things that are just sort of pure abstract kinds of questions, or you could say something like, population of Boston divided by, I don't know, Chicago. And what it will do is understand the natural language of that question and then compute the answer and tell us various kinds of things, like there's looks like that's a logarithmic time series. Maybe we can show that on linear scale instead. Wow, okay. Didn't realize that Chicago had been growing so much relative to Boston. So there are lots of kinds of things. So what we're doing here is using computational knowledge, computational intelligence. This is all based on our long-time efforts to curate knowledge and data about the world and algorithms and methods and models about the world. So for example, let me try typing something else in. Maybe I can type something like that, and maybe it'll initially be recognized as genome sequence. Okay, that was oops, let me just not what I need there. Let's make it a bit shorter. Okay, let's say this is some potential genome sequence. And now what it will do is it'll compute various things about it. It'll go look it up on the human genome. It'll find various genes associated with that. I could probably go click on one of these. I have no idea what this is, but that's some particular gene. It will have various kinds of data about that gene. What's important here is, as I say, this is kind of sort of drive-by access to computational intelligence. Later, we'll talk about how you make use of this data, which is now in computable form, to actually work things out from it. So maybe let's try something different. Let's say, let's ask for a growth chart. Let's say girl, age 8. And let's see, do I know anything about children? Let's see if that is a plausible height. Okay, there we go. So there, it's saying, it's understanding that natural language. It's saying, given that that data, it's now figuring out where that lies on this normal distribution in this case, and projecting various things about, let's see, what's the expected weight distribution? Okay, other kinds of data here. So that's another kind of example of computing things in this way. Let's try something else. Let's say we say apple plus orange. We have a very large amount of nutritional data that we've collected. You'll see many different kinds of apples that you can ask about here, but here it will go and compute for 1 apple plus 1 orange. It will kind of synthesize the nutrition facts. It'll then be able to give one to a high level of detail, all kinds of nutritional data about those particular foods. Or we could say, I don't know, let's try one more medical-ish kind of thing. Let's say male, age 60, LDL 175. So now it'll use some public health data to compute where in the distribution of, it'll slice through that distribution and figure out at what percentile that particular finding would be. Maybe we can go and, I think maybe if I say use that as a formula instead, it'll go and dig into the Framingham Heart study and give one various kinds of results based on that. So, and this is, so there's all sorts of data. Let's see, if I just type in something like, okay, use that as an ICD-9 code, and it'll have some information about the incidence of that particular code and so on. So these are things which we've been steadily sort of accumulating all this computational knowledge over a long period of time now. And it gradually is finding its way into more and more places. One recent place it's found its way into is Excel, Microsoft is now using this to provide, if you look at the data tab in a modern Excel, you'll find all sorts of things here. Let's try typing something in. I'm not a big Excel user, so I might not be able to do this very well. But if I type fibula here and I go and I press the anatomy tab in this data thing, maybe what will happen, let's see what happens here. Then I will get, this is all of our data. So we can say, I don't know, let's see what happens if I try that. Okay, all right, so that's telling me, not stuff I really know about, but that's telling me, that's getting me some data there. If I put in here a whole collection of foods, for example, let's say I said orange juice. I don't know whether it can do 1 cup of orange juice. We could certainly do that ourselves. I'm not sure if that's available yet in Excel. Let's see. See whether it can compute that. Oh, yes, it can. Okay, so now we could say 1 cup of orange juice, and now we could say something like iron percentage daily value, and that's giving us the result. And we could go, let's try seeing what happens if we say nutrition label. Okay. How do I get the nutrition label? I don't know how to use Excel well enough. Well, there should be a nice nutrition label available here. Maybe I have to make that cell bigger. No, not quite. Okay. Well, in any case, the point here is that all of this computational knowledge that we have is slowly flowing into Excel. It's also just started to be available in Word, and you'll see it in other places in the future. But I guess what I really wanted to talk about is what's underneath all of this. So what's happening in Wolfram Alpha, for example, when we type these kinds of natural language queries, what's it actually doing? What it's doing is it's converting that natural language into our computational language, what we call Wolfram Language, that we've been developing for the past basically 35 years now. And let me show you now sort of what's underneath, what that turns into. So what I'm going to do now is just type directly Wolfram Language rather than typing natural language. So for example, I could just compute some random piece of math or something, or I could start doing other kinds of computation. So let's say I say, generate me a random graph. So let's say I might have a random graph with 100 nodes, 200 edges. There's my graph. The idea of Wolfram Language is to be able to represent anything we want computationally and be able to compute directly with those things as kind of computational objects. So I can say, make a community graph plot from that graph. And this is, Wolfram Language is a symbolic language. So it can deal with any kind of thing. So, if I type in X, it just corresponds to X. And for example, I could, let's say I pick up an image. Let me just capture my image here from Zoom. There's an image. And now I could say something like, I could say here, let's say edge detect that image. Or I could say something like, I could use some kind of machine learning thing to say, let me get to, let's see what happens if I say, find me facial features from that image. It might have to load in some neural network to be able to figure out how to do that. Should get me some data about that. So kind of the idea here is be able to compute about anything. Okay, not bad. And some be able to compute about anything. And the concept here is to have a language in which we can express computational kinds of ideas in a way that both the computer can understand and we can understand. So let's try some other kinds of things. So let's say I get, we also want to have sort of a knowledge of the world. So let's say there's a list of words in English. Maybe I could say, take the first letter from each of those words and then make a word cloud out of that. And sort of the idea here is that I'm writing Wolfram Language, I'm writing this computational language in a form which both the computer can understand and we can read and understand. And so, and also that we are able to make use of kind of the knowledge of the world that's built into this computational language. So for example, here I might, let's say I could pick some other human language here, let's say Russian, and I can do the same computation for that. So let's see, we could do, let's do something, a different kind of thing. Let's do some geographic kind of thing. Let's say we say capital cities in South America. So now what we're doing is we're using natural language to give input that is converted to our symbolic language, and then we can compute the list of these cities. And so, for example, if I pick up one of these cities here, say Brasilia, we would know various properties of that city. So we might know what's the population of that city. And we can give that result. Or we could just say, show me a plot of where those cities are in the world. And we get the result there. And we could, for example, let's say we say here, oh, I don't know, we could compute different things. We could compute, let's say, a shortest tour between these cities, or all sorts of other kinds of things. But so again, this is very much making use of the fact that this is a symbolic language. So just as we can have 2s and 3s and arrays of numbers and things, we can have things as entities built into the language that represent things like cities. Well, let's do something more anatomical. Let's say something like left hand. And now we could say something like, let's just say anatomy plot 3D of that. And this will just take, this will now use the built-in data that we have about anatomy and give us, hopefully, an anatomical, there we go, a nice anatomical plot there. But what's important about this is that data is also available in computable form. So we can have this sort of standardized geometry of this bone, and we can start solving differential equations that represent stress in that bone and all sorts of other kinds of things. And that's all things that can be done directly within Wolfram Language. Another area I might just show you is what we can do with molecules. So for example, let's say I say molecule of caffeine, and that will now be an entity that represents a caffeine molecule. And so I could say something like molecule plot 3D of that. And now I'll get just a picture of a caffeine molecule, or I could say something like, biosequence of, let's not make it too long here. Let's say something like this. And then we could say, show me a molecule show me the molecule that corresponds to that. And maybe I can try and live slightly down. How big is this? Not too big, I think. And make a 3D molecule plot of that, and so on. So this is all kind of things that one can compute, and where one's making use of the computational language to represent the computations one's doing, and computational knowledge to know what one is computing about. So there are all kinds of different things we could do here. We could say something like, well, let's do something with, let's say, audio. So I can say something like audio capture, and I can say, let's say I say, hello, let me talk to my computer. So this will now record a piece of audio. Now I can say, show me a spectrogram of that audio. And that's the spectrogram showing that audio. I might be able to say, let's see what happens if I say speech recognize of that piece of audio. That was, let's pick it up here. Okay, so now this is going to be using some machine learning. Okay, didn't quite get all my words, but didn't do too badly on being able to recognize that piece of audio input. And in general, let's take a little look at what happens when you do machine learning kinds of things. So let's for example let's take this picture up here again, and let's just say we just want to say image identify of that picture, and let's see what kind of silly thing it says is in the picture. A person. Okay, great. If we wanted to, we could kind of drill down and see what's happening inside there. We can say, and again, it's very important that we have kind of a symbolic representation of everything. This is now an actual neural net represented symbolically. We can kind of drill in and see the different layers of this neural net, drill down and see everything it does. But now we can go and say, let's take that picture and let's feed it to that neural net. And now instead of giving us the final result, let's just take the first, I don't know, 5 layers of that neural net and see what it does. What's sort of happening inside the neural net. It's not very useful with that list of numbers, but let's say we just make that into a bunch of images. And so this gives us a sense of sort of what the neural net is thinking about inside. and that's relevant if you're interested. Maybe I'll talk later about kind of the problem of making why it's really not possible in the end to both have sort of the strongest computation and be able to explain what's happening inside. But we can get some idea of sort of what the neural net is thinking about inside as it does this computation. Well, so let's see the kinds of things that let me give some other indications of things. I'm a big data enthusiast, so I think I'm probably the human who's recorded the most data about themselves of anybody. So I have all kinds of strange data. This is from years ago, actually. This is, oh boy, that ends in 2012. That is, what is that? That's probably outgoing pieces of email as a function of time of day, showing that yes, I was asleep at a pretty systematic time then. Or for example, I've got keystrokes that I've typed and all sorts of things like that. Let me show you. I think I had here we go. This is, so we have this idea of data bins, which are things that you can throw data into in our cloud. And here's a data bin. Let's say this is, let's just do this. This should be a data bin of steps that I've taken in the last decade or so. So for example, here I can say, you know, make a date list plot of this is just the number of steps as a function of time. So there it is. And you can see the pandemic caused me to be very systematic about how far I was walking. Let's make a histogram, for example, of the number of steps there. So let's say this, and so this will now let me just visualize. I'm a very habitual person, so this is a distribution of the number of steps I've walked each day for the past 10 years or so. So let's and we can go and look at other kinds of things. I was actually just about to look at something. I've been curious about how many times have I been? Let's see. I've been sick a few times in the past decade, and I was trying to figure out how to correlate that with where I've been and what I've been doing at times when I've got sick. Is it more important that I'm out and about with people, or is it more important whether I got tired and jet lagged and all kinds of other things? And so that's a kind of thing that I can expect to be able to find, and it will probably take me about 15 minutes to grind through that data and with the tools that we have and try and answer that question for myself, for my little n of not really even one sample for that kind of thing. Well, lots of sorts of things one can do. Let me maybe not, I can show you a bunch of examples. Let's see if I've got a couple here. During the during these COVID times, there's been a lot of work that's been done by people with our tools on epidemiology and other kinds of things related to COVID. I should explain something. This thing that I'm typing into here is what we call a notebook. We invented this idea of notebooks back in 1987. And about 25 years later, notebooks became all the rage in sort of lots of different software environments. But it's something that I always thought was one of the more trivial kinds of advances that we made when we first started developing Wolfram Language. But here I could say something like, personal analytics data here. And this notebook is something where I can mix text with code and so on. I could also just say, take this notebook and publish it to the cloud. And everything that I'm doing here, I could also have been doing in just directly in a web browser. I'm doing it in a local client on my machine, but I could be doing it in a web browser. And this should publish this notebook to the cloud, and hopefully it will generate a URL, which I could send to you guys. It might take a little while because it's got some big pictures and things in it. There we go. Okay, actually here, there's a QR code of for this notebook. You can open that on any phone or web browser. Let me just for the sake of, maybe I'll post another one later, but I could just post this if I can find chat. I can post this into the chat if people are interested here. Another thing I might mention is that in addition to kind of the idea of notebooks, I kind of have this idea that I've been sort of talking about for more than 30 years now, and people slowly catch on to doing it more and more, this idea of computational essays as a way to present what one is talking about. It's sort of a mixture of text together with perhaps math and other things, but with code, with computational language, with things in both human language and computational language. And the idea is that in addition to reading the computational language, reading the natural language, you can read the computational language to understand what one is describing. So it's kind of, the notion is to use computational language as part of communicating the message of what's going on. But then the great advantage is when you send somebody something that's written in computational language, they can immediately run it and make their own adjustments to it and so on. So this is kind of the concept there. I can show you some other examples, perhaps. Oh yeah, I might mention okay, these are some all sorts of examples. This is epidemiology modeling with Wolfram Language. I suspect this is a big ordinary differential equations adventure. Actually, we have a thing called system modeler, which is kind of an adjunct to Wolfram Language, which is intended for large-scale engineering systems modeling, used for figuring out things about jet engines and so on, but also used for doing system modeling of biological kinds of systems. And again, that's all sort of integrated into Wolfram Language, so you can take these simulations and then compute with them and so on. I might mention when it comes to external data, one of the things that's of interest is something a company called Emerald has been doing with our technology. They've been building an automated lab that covers a large collection of biology and chemistry experiments. And kind of the concept of this lab is that you basically are writing Wolfram Language code, and you just you write the code that specifies the experiment you want to run. Maybe you FedEx the sample to them, then what happens is that Wolfram Language code turns into actual operation of robotic devices and so on to do the experiment, and then the results are put back into a private version of our cloud for people to do analysis from. I think it's something that's going to be a very exciting direction for biomedical research. I know they just announced that Carnegie Mellon is building a big sort of clone of the Emerald, of the existing Emerald Cloud Lab, and I think more will be coming on that soon. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the bigger picture of kind of this computational language idea. So, what are we trying to do? We're trying to represent all these different kinds of things that we talk about in the world, whether they're things about anatomy or chemicals or places or whatever. We're trying to represent them all computationally so that we can think about them in computational terms and actually do computations about them. And this is, I think, a pretty important direction to be able to sort of take all these different areas and make them computational. I kind of see what we're doing as having an analogy in the long distant past, when people were first thinking about mathematics. For a few thousand years, the main way that mathematics was expressed was just in words, in ordinary human language. And then about 400 years ago, people started inventing mathematical notation and plus signs and equal signs and things like that. And the result of that was the creation of algebra and then calculus, and in general, the creation of the mathematical sciences. Well, what I see us trying to do with our computational language is to provide that same kind of notation, but for computational kinds of things rather than mathematical kinds of things. And one of the big consequences of that is in the enabling of computational X, for all kinds of fields that one might imagine, seeing how to build a computational version of that field. And I think this is a really important thing that we're just sort of starting to see the effects of. Well, it's and by the way, in an area like biomedicine, in a sense, computers have obviously been already very important in biomedicine, but I see a lot of their use as being more at the sort of bureaucratic level of being able to take chunks of data and be able to sort of move them around to the right place, do these kinds of things. The programming languages that have existed have been the traditional programming languages are really intended to say, here's what a computer intrinsically does. It moves around arrays of numbers, it arranges these things in files and so on. Let's provide a wrapper around sort of what computers intrinsically do and build up these programs around that. Kind of the goal of computational language is sort of the opposite of that. It's take the things that we care about in the world and try and represent those computationally so that in the end, they can be interpreted and handled by computers. But sort of the goal is not build up from what the computer does, it's go from the way things are in the world and attach that to what computers are able to do. And that's been kind of our long-term goal and mission to do that. And I kind of see the sort of this idea of computational language, it's gradually spreading to more and more places. It's been something that we've been rather unique in having built out for the past basically 40 years now. But it's something that I see it as being something which is sort of an inevitable feature of the progression of computing. I mean, back when I first started using computers, it was a raw computer. There wasn't any operating system, there weren't any languages, but over time, one got to take sort of, there's an operating system on every computer. Eventually, there's a user interface, there's networking, and so on. In time, we will get to see that there's computational intelligence and computational language as something that we can just take for granted as a thing that exists when we kind of just walk up to a computer. And that takes one to a sort of much higher level in terms of what one can do with computation and how one can start using computation, not just as a sort of tool for doing things, but as something that one can think in terms of. So let me turn now to sort of the second big topic that I wanted to talk about, which was kind of the conceptual use of computation and its relationship to biomedicine and so on. So many years ago now, I used to do physics, and I now do physics again, but I got interested in sort of a fundamental natural science question, which is how do complicated things get produced in nature, whether in biology or in turbulent fluids in physics or lots of other places. And so I started trying to figure out how would one make models that could represent complex kinds of things. And at first I started using, differential equations and all the usual kinds of tools that exist from mathematics and mathematical physics. And I found that that wasn't a very successful way to think about making models of those kinds of things. So I got to start thinking about, well, is there a more general way to think about doing modeling? And the question was sort of what's the most general kind of thing that we can use as raw material for making models of things? And what I realized is that there's a more general thing than sort of the traditional mathematical equations that we've been familiar with, and that's the kinds of things that we see in programs. And so I got interested in, okay, if nature is using programs to, if sort of what's happening in nature is following the rules of programs, what might those programs be like? And so I started thinking about what do the very simplest possible programs do? We can sort of imagine this computational universe of possible programs, and we can ask, what do they do? And so here's an example, a very simple kind of program that I looked at. This is called the cellular automaton, and it's just a line of cells. Each cell is either black or white. And then in a series of steps, it's just growing with a rule that I can represent down here that says, this rule basically says every time there's a black cell in this neighborhood of 3 cells, make the middle cell be black on the next step. And so that you can think about this rule as being a very simple program. And the question is, what do simple programs like that typically do? Here's another example of such a program. This is what we get. Again, very simple program, very simple behavior. And so one thing one might imagine is, well, if the program is sufficiently simple, the behavior will somehow be correspondingly simple. Here's a different example, same kind of program. If we run it a bit longer, we'll find it makes this nice, very intricate nested fractal pattern. Although still we could say, well, even though it's intricate, it's still in some sense very regular. Okay, so many years ago, I did an experiment where I just did the very obvious thing, which we can now do in a few seconds in Wolfram Language, where I just look at all possible rules of the particular kind I've been showing you and just say, what do these rules, what actually happens with all these different rules? Well, my all-time favorite is rule 30. This is what it does. So there's its rule at the bottom. It's a very simple rule. We're starting it off from just one black cell at the top. And the surprising thing is that even though the rule is very simple, even though it starts off from something very simple at the top, the pattern that we get is very complicated. And so we can see that there's a certain amount of regularity over here on the left, but many aspects of this pattern are, for practical purposes, completely random. And this is something that I discovered as sort of a general feature of the computational universe of possible programs. Out in the computational universe of possible programs, it's extremely common for even very simple programs to show very complicated behavior. It's not what we're used to from things like engineering. When we do engineering, we're used to staying within that very narrow collection of methodologies where we can foresee what kind of behavior we're going to get. And so we don't end up seeing sort of this general computational behavior. Well, we can go and look at other kinds of simple programs. There's another one. We could start enumerating these possible programs. It's the one thing that one notices very quickly is that the kinds of behavior one gets, even from these very simple programs, have a certain lifelike character to them. And needless to say, one can go on and actually use these models to study different kinds of growth phenomena in biology, and they do very well, and you can understand a lot of things from that. But perhaps I should say something about what does it mean? How does one think about this phenomenon of the fact that there is such complicated behavior that can be produced from such simple rules out in the computational universe? I think that the deepest sort of principle from which that one understands that is the thing I call the principle of computational equivalence. And kind of the idea is the following. We're asking what kind of a computation is going on when something like this happens. We can think of this as there's some input at the top, it's going and crunching along and it's producing some output. That corresponds to a computation. How sophisticated is that computation? Is it a computation? And the thing that the principle of computational equivalence says is when the behavior of the system is not obviously simple, the sophistication of that computation will be the maximum it can be, and it will be equivalent to the computations that can be done by all other systems. So what does this mean? Well, one of the things it means is, one of the consequences it has is this phenomenon of universal computation, the idea that you can have a fixed piece of hardware and run different programs to get different computations. That's the idea that kind of launched the whole, launched everything we have in computing today. Actually, people have imagined that to make a universal computer, you have to go to lots of trouble. You have to put lots of components together very carefully. What this tells one, what the principle of computational equivalence tells one, is that that's not the case, that actually universal computers are quite ubiquitous in the computational universe. Even very simple rules can do universal computation. And that will have a bunch of significance when we think about kind of molecular scale behavior in, for example, molecular biology and so on. But another consequence that this principle of computational equivalence has is the following. In science, one is used to the idea that one's goal is once one has a model, one can predict what's going to happen. Well, how does one predict what's going to happen? Basically, the system itself is going along, it's computing what's happening to it. But then we, from the outside, are going to jump ahead, and we're going to be smarter than the system itself. We're going to jump ahead and figure out what the system will do much more efficiently than the system itself does it. But this principle of computational equivalence tells us that that can't always work, because it tells us that our brains, our computers, our mathematics, and so on, is actually no more computationally sophisticated than even some simple system like the one I have on the screen. And so that tells one that a phenomenon that I call computational irreducibility. It tells one that there's really no way to work out what's going to happen in a system like this more efficiently than just by letting it run and seeing what happens. There's no way to make that fast prediction of what's going to happen. You know, we've been used to, in the mathematical sciences, we've been used to things like, I don't know, solving some particular equation or working out, you know, the motion of the Earth around an idealized sun. And we've been used to the idea that we can just plug the number 1,000,000 into a formula and say, that's where the Earth is going to be 1,000,000 years from now, without having to kind of trace each orbit and see what actually happens. What computational irreducibility implies is that out in the computational universe of possible programs, that's not the common behavior. What instead is much more common is that the actual behavior of the system is computationally irreducible. There's no way to work out what it will do other than by just running it and seeing what happens. So this has all sorts of consequences. I mean, for example, one could ask a question like, one has some particular kind of system. One could say, this is just running down one side, then the next, and so on. One could say, will this ever die out? Well, one can sort of imagine some biological kinds of questions like that. I mean, is this going to be some malignant process which will just grow forever, or will it eventually stop growing? That's something which is caught up in this computational irreducibility idea. It's something where, in fact, you can't necessarily work out immediately from the beginning what's going to happen. You really just have to computationally trace each step and see what's going to happen. So we think about simulating things, and we think about, well, that's a convenient thing to do, but actually computational irreducibility implies not just convenient, it's fundamentally necessary in many cases. Well, so this idea of the sort of the core idea here, though, is to start using these simple programs like cellular automata, other kinds of simple programs, as sort of raw material for making models of things. And we can kind of start, and one of the things that's been really a dramatic phenomenon over the last couple of decades is that for about 300 years before that, when people wanted to make models of things, they turned to mathematical equations and they tried to make models using equations. And there were areas where that worked, particularly in physics. There are areas where that did not work so well, and many areas of biology are among those. What's happened in the past 20 years or so, maybe some of it can be attributed to this big book I wrote called The New Kind of Science that came out about 20 years ago, that there's been kind of this big movement that new models that get made for all sorts of things in all kinds of areas are not made on the basis of equations, they're made on the basis of programs. And that gives one a much richer kind of raw material for making models of things. And that allows gives one much more potential to make models in areas like biology. It also means that there are phenomena that are very different from the phenomena we're used to seeing in mathematical equations, of which probably computational irreducibility is the front and center most important phenomenon. And it kind of gives one a different view of what's predictable and what's not, and so on. Well, okay, let me talk a little bit about well, let's see. So one of the things that one can think about from given this idea that simple programs can produce very complicated behavior, can model lots of kinds of things, provide raw material for making models of things, what can we model that way? Well, we can think about modeling very practical things in biology and medicine and so on. We can talk about that in a little bit. But sort of the biggest thing that we might imagine modeling is our whole universe. Question is, might there actually be a simple program that represents our whole universe? Well, the surprising thing that I've been working on this since the 1990s, actually, but made a bit of a breakthrough about 2 years ago, which has led to this thing we call the Wolfram Physics Project, which is really a rather dramatic success, quite unexpected as far as I'm concerned. I think that we can now fairly say that we understand pretty much how the underlying machine code of the physical universe works. And let me say as a preview that understanding turns out to lead us to various kinds of modeling, which I think have very direct consequences for things like biomedicine. So let me walk through a little bit of what we understand now about physics. And let me say also that one of the most powerful things is that because this modeling, this approach to modeling covers both physics and other things, we can start using the successes of physics and importing them into other kinds of fields. So I'm not going to talk about this in great detail, but there's much to say about it, and there's lots of people now working on these ideas. But let me just give you a rough sense of this. So when we think about physics and space and time and things like that, there's been this kind of assumption that's been made from kind of Euclid on that space is just something you put things into. It isn't made of anything particularly. That's very different from something like water. Water, you can say, well, it just flows and it can go anywhere it wants. But actually, we know that underneath, water is made of molecules, just a bunch of molecules bouncing around. So one of the first ideas that our physics project is based on is the idea that space is made of things too. That underneath space, there are these elements, these kind of atoms of space. And our universe probably right now might be 10 to the 400 of these atoms of space, each just discrete points. And the only thing we know about these points is how they're connected to each other. They're not placed in space. We don't have a notion of space. We just have this bag of 10 to the 400 points. And in a sense, we know the friend network of these points. We know how these points are related to each other. That's all we know. And it turns out that much like in the case of something like water, where all those discrete molecules bouncing around on a large scale have the effect of giving us fluid dynamics, so similarly, all those discrete atoms of space connected in all these ways have the effect of giving us something that's like continuous space, and more than that, have the effect of giving us Einstein's equations and phenomena of gravity and things like that. Those emerge in the same kind of way that the dynamics, fluid dynamics, the equations of fluid dynamics emerge from sort of low-level molecular dynamics. And one of the things that is notable about this, this model is, so the idea is you have this giant graph of connections between the atoms of space, and there's a rule that tells you kind of how to update that graph. And that rule says whenever you see a little piece of graph that looks like this, update it to one that looks like that. And that just gets done everywhere it can be done. Okay, so the everywhere it can be done statement is very important because it turns out there isn't just one unique set of places where that update can be done. And that's important because it's what gives us quantum mechanics. So in physics, kind of the traditional view of classical physics is definite things happen in the world. You throw a ball, it follows a definite trajectory. The sort of big idea of quantum mechanics is that's not how things work. Instead, the ball follows many different possible paths, and we get to measure certain probabilities of different outcomes. Well, the way that works in these models is that there are all these different possible histories that can occur for the system that correspond to different possible ways these updates could happen. And we make this thing we call a multi-way graph that is essentially a map of all the different possible histories for the universe. And what then happens is we can look at what are the entanglements, what are the relationships between these different threads of history for the universe. And that gives us this kind of notion of a space that isn't physical space, it's what we call branchial space, the space of quantum branches. And this is a different kind of space. And this is the space basically in which quantum mechanics plays out. Now, something that is a little bit mind twisting, but the way that quantum mechanics works and the way, the reason it kind of seems so strange to us is when we are observing a quantum process, we are essentially minds or brains embedded in the same multi-way graph of all these branching histories of the universe. And so we get into this very strange kind of situation where we're asking, how does a branching brain perceive a branching universe? And it's that kind of interplay between the branching brain and the branching universe that gives us the kind of strange phenomena of quantum mechanics. And it's deeply related to kind of the fact that sort of a key feature of the way that we experience the world, the kind of our consciousness, is that we at least believe that there's a single thread of time that sort of exists in our experience. And it's that sort of collating of things into that single thread of time that leads us to the features of quantum mechanics, also leads us to kind of the view of space-time that we have. But okay, so there's many things to say about how this plays out and how one can work out all sorts of things in quantum field theory and black holes and all sorts of things like this. But the main point is that what's happening is we start off from just these atoms of space, these very simple rules about updating atoms of space. And then we're asking, what is the large scale effect of that as observed by, in this case, observers embedded within that system? Okay, so this kind of model that involves these multi-way graphs and all these different threads of history and so on, turns out that that type of model seems to be pretty important for understanding many kinds of systems, including perhaps some biomedical kinds of systems. So let me show you, for example, this is something I just wrote a couple of weeks ago now about this kind of multi-computation as a fourth general paradigm for theoretical science. So this is, I think, kind of a big deal, but it'll take a long time for this to get fully worked out. But let me give you kind of the preview as I see it today. So it really has to do with how do you fundamentally think about making models of things. And in a sense, these models, these different epochs of modeling are distinguished by the view of time that they have. So back in antiquity, the fundamental thing people wanted to do is say, what are things made of? What is the sort of structural content of things? Are things made of atoms? Are they made of this? Are they made of that? There's not really much of a description of time, of the dynamic progress of these things. It's more just what are things made of? When we get to the 1600s and we get to kind of the mathematical paradigm for things, then it's it's where we write down a formula for things. How does time enter that formula? It's just a parameter. We can just pick whatever value we want for time. We can just dial time to be whatever value we want in the solutions to these equations. Then the big thing from the sort of 1980s and this kind of idea of computational models is this notion of time is really this inexorable progress of computation. The progress of time is the execution of a computation. So you can't get to jump ahead. You have computational irreducibility. Time, it's not just like in the mathematical paradigm, we just turn that dial to figure out what's going to happen. Later, you have to actually run the computation. Okay, so that's that story. The new story is this kind of multi-computational paradigm in which there isn't just a single thread of time. Instead, there are these many different threads of history which branch and merge. And that's in that situation that you have this kind of these multiple threads of time. One of the things that happens is that even to know what happened in the system, you have to have some description of the observer of the system. In, for example, the computational paradigm, it may be difficult to work out what happens after 1 billion steps, but once you have the state of the system after 1 billion steps, it's right there. You can see the sequence of black and white cells or whatever it is to see how that system behaves. In the multi-computational paradigm, that's not the case. You have to actually explain how the observer is going to sample the system. What that turns into in physics is things like reference frames and relativity and quantum measurement processes and so on. Those are descriptions of the observer that tell you out of all those atoms of space, what is it? How do we knit together? How do we perceive all those atoms of space and what they do to be something that has sort of a coherent, that's a coherent thing that we can describe using laws that we can understand. So, okay, why is this relevant to anything else? So one reason is, if we look at this multi-computational process of this idea of we've got all these different possible paths of history, it might remind you of something. It might remind you of things like chemical synthesis. It might remind you of the idea that there are, when you have chemical reactions, you're saying there are these chemicals, they interact in this way, they produce this other chemical. And in fact, there are a couple of different analogies. That's one is chemical reactions. Another is mathematical theorem proving, where you're saying, I've got this particular mathematical result. Now I'm going to apply some axiom. I'm going to use this result I've already got to derive another result. We build up this whole network of mathematical results. We build up this whole network of different different molecules and so on in chemical synthesis. So for example, in typical synthesis, what one's interested in doing is saying, well, there is this possible graph of all these possible interactions between molecules, but we just want to synthesize this one particular molecule. So we want to find a path through that graph that best gets us from the original things that we put in to the final output that we're trying to get. Okay, so one of the things one starts to think about is, if we think about kind of molecular biology processes, for example, biochemical processes, we can ask the question, how should we think about those processes? And ultimately what's happening is it's a bunch of molecules bouncing around, interacting in various ways, having chemical reactions, producing other molecules and so on. And the question is, how should we, what is the correct zoomed out way of what's going on there? And so this gets us into this question of, so what is the chemical observer really like? And what we're used to saying is that what we measure about these systems is just the total concentrations of molecules. And then we write down differential equations that represent these different chemical processes and so on. And we solve those equations to work out what will happen. So it's sort of an interesting thing as far as I'm concerned. It's kind of like, what is the foundational way that one should think about biological processes? And what's the kind of right paradigm for thinking about biology? And I think that the thing that is an interesting piece of history, if you go back before 1953 and you ask, what did genetics look like? You realize that there were lots of different effects and lots of different complicated things, and there were a lot of empirical results and so on. And then, but there wasn't a great kind of overarching kind of conceptual framework to think about those kinds of things in. And then along came the idea of digital information being stored in DNA, this notion that a single molecule could store all this digital information. And then it gradually became much clearer how those kinds of systems worked, from this idea that what's important in the biological system is this information that's stored in a single molecule. So one of the questions right now is, when you look at various biochemical processes, where is the information? What's important about what's going on? What is the important feature of that, of what's happening? And when we start thinking about this kind of multi-computational paradigm and this idea of interactions between all these different molecules, we can say, what is the important thing we get out of this? What does a chemical observer really measure? And I've been thinking about this very recently, so this is very not really off the press yet at all. It's still gestating. But the question is there, when we think about molecular processes, is it the case that what we should be looking at is just chemical concentrations, or should we be looking at these molecule scale dynamical processes? And in the case of physics, there is this concept of causal graphs that represent causal relationships between events, causal relationships between molecular interactions, and so on. And the question is it in fact the case that some, perhaps a lot, of information in biochemistry is stored not in things like the concentrations of molecules, but more in this detailed dynamics of individual molecular interactions? And one obvious place where there's the potential to think about these kinds of things is the immune system. And there's a bunch that I've been learning about all this stuff. I thought I knew something about this like 30 years ago, and I kind of checked into theoretical immunology again now, and I was a little bit shocked to find out that some models that I'd come up with a long time ago had sort of found their way into that area, and I didn't think they were that great models. So I think there's lots of growth potential in that area. And I think one of the things that's of interest there is sort of to what extent are dynamic processes really the place where information is stored, and how do you think about the storage of information in dynamic processes? And so my little challenge for myself over the last couple of weeks, so this is not at all gestated, but it's like things like PCR are kind of methods for essentially being a chemical observer of certain kinds of things. The question is, if you look at these dynamic processes, is there a way by making some kind of meta-catalyst type thing, membrane-like thing, to have some way to amplify not the output, not the structure of molecules and how many of them there are, but more these dynamical processes between molecules? So that's a little bit of kind of sort of my latest thinking. But one of the things that's important about this kind of general, I should have made another point about this sort of multi-computational idea. What happens is at the lowest level, there's all this elaborate computation going on. For example, in the case of physics, there might be 10 to the 400 atoms of space, and they're all doing their complicated things. And at sort of the lowest level in the physical universe, it will be lots of computational irreducibility. There'll be nothing we can say about what's happening. The big surprise is that when we observe all of those atoms of space in the way that we as observers operate, we see laws of physics like general relativity, like quantum mechanics. So in other words, there is, from the perspective of us as observers, we deduce certain kinds of global laws that turn out, in the case of physics, to be useful global laws. So one of the things that I know to be the case is that as soon as you have one of these multi-computational systems, it is inevitably the case that there are certain global laws that emerge for certain kinds of observers. It matters very little what the underlying details of sort of the sort of atomic level of a multi-computational system are. It's a bit similar to what happens in statistical mechanics, thermodynamics, and so on. You can have, molecules of air bouncing around, or you can have molecules of water bouncing around. In both cases, you get the same kind of equations of fluid dynamics. It doesn't matter what the underlying molecules are like. In multi-computation, there's an even bigger version of that, and it really doesn't matter whether you're talking about molecules in a chemical process or you're talking about atoms of space. There are certain global features of multi-computation which are the same. At least they're the same if you have observers who have certain kinds of similarities. So you kind of have to sort of push this point of the physical observer of space-time, for example. How similar are they to the chemical observer of molecular processes? I don't know the answer to that yet. But I think one of the things that's an interesting possibility is that when you think about the correct kind of chemical observer, you are kind of encoding information. You're thinking about the way that something like molecular biology encodes information very differently from the way that one has thought about it traditionally, and in the same kind of sort of surprise that the idea of digital information being stored on molecules might have been in the past. Now it's a story of how much does the detailed dynamics store information. So I should wrap up in a moment here, but let me just give a little bit more of a sort of sketch of at least my, from the outsider's view of kind of biomedical kinds of things. I mean, I suppose one of the questions is, what does computational irreducibility mean for medicine? What does it mean that there are these, in a sense, it's the explanation for why there haven't been more global theories in medicine. It's because you really just have to, it isn't something where you can expect to make kind of a Newtonian gravity type theory of things. It's not something where you can expect to just sort of write down a formula and say that's the answer. So you have to adopt different kinds of methods, but it doesn't mean you can't make any kind of theory. It just means that the kinds of things you might have been looking for in a traditional mathematical theory aren't the kinds of things to look for. So that's sort of a question of what should you be looking for? Well, I think one of the things we have to realize is that we can think about, we think about computation happening in computers with semiconductors and so on. But as I mentioned, one of the discoveries is that in this computational universe of possible programs, computation is a very ubiquitous phenomenon. Sophisticated computation is a ubiquitous phenomenon, and it can happen at the level of molecules as well. Unfortunately, to date, we only have one example of a successful large-scale deployment of molecular computation, and that's us as biological systems. We don't have yet a technological version of that. We should have, and we will have, but we don't yet. And so our one example of kind of molecular scale computation is biology. And now we get to use a bunch of the intuition that we understand from sort of other places where we think about computation and apply it to biology. There are questions like, I don't know, how many different cell types are there really in something? Well, as soon as you start looking at simple programs and you look at, for example, cellular automata and all the different forms they produce, you start realizing, gosh, when we start classifying these things by morphology, it's just not going to work that way, because there's just going to be this huge diversity of different kinds of outcomes from programs and so on. So, and I think the other thing to realize is that in a sense, the classification of, let's say, diseases, the ICD classification, I don't know, 100,000 diseases or whatever it is now, that's a very strange kind of thing to be thinking about, because if we think about that at this sort of foundational computational level, it's very hard to, we immediately realize there's actually an infinite number. And so then the question is, what are the general categories of these things, and how do you classify what happens in the computational universe? And that's an interesting matter of basic science that hasn't been explored as much as it should have been. People have explored pure mathematics a lot. They haven't explored what I've started calling ruleology, the theory of what happens with different kinds of simple rules. That is much less explored, but that's the place you have to look to try and understand the sort of the classification of kinds of things that can happen computationally. I think the way that one thing that I find interesting in sort of the comparison between practical computing and biomedicine is that in biomedicine, you have ICD-9 codes or whatever that classify diseases. For software, we do not have any such thing. There is no classification of software diseases. Certainly people who run large server systems as we do know perfectly well there are things that go wrong. There are definite classes of things that go wrong, but those have never been classified. In the case of practical computer systems, we potentially have a lot more data than we do in the case than we can easily get in the case of biological systems. I think it's worth understanding. So we can kind of imagine, our sort of toy model for medical diagnosis and so on is the case of software diagnosis. And one of the things that I suppose is interesting is this question of when you have large amounts of data that you can say large amounts of information about what happened in a biological system or a computational system, kind of what do you do with that? And do you first say, well, let's make a diagnosis and then go and figure out what to do? Or do you go straight to sort of the end result of, oh, well, then we'll make this change? And that's something where we go straight from kind of the observed data to the what should we now do? I kind of think that the future of these things is kind of a little bit more like what's happened in, for example, finance, where there are technical traders who will look at some stock chart and say, I recognize that pattern of stock prices, it's a head and shoulders configuration, and that means I should sell. That's essentially a diagnosis of this data, raw data, and then a decision about what to do. But sort of the thing that in the world of quant finance, for example, has happened is just going directly from the raw data through some algorithm to then work out what to do. And I suppose in the case of biology, the thing that is sort of the interesting question is, to what extent will it be possible to do that? How does computational irreducibility play into that? At what point will we have enough knowledge of molecular computing that instead of basically making things like drug molecules that just statically go and do a particular thing, we can make an algorithmic drug, a molecule that can actually compute on its own to figure out things about what to do. Part of being able to do that requires kind of understanding the fundamental computational architecture of biological processes. And so that's a thing that I think one might be able to make some progress in now. But so I kind of think that the sort of eventual picture one would expect is one where one's got all of this data coming in, one is then sort of able to process it in some algorithmic way to get essentially some algorithmic process to be the thing that is the intervention that one's making in the biological system. And there's lots to say, which has not been very well worked out, about sort of, well, what consequence does that have? Even in the toy model of software debugging, how do you make interventions in software, and what consequences do they have, and what kinds of overall behavior can you see? All right, I covered a lot of things here, and all went rather quickly, and sorry, I went slightly over time, but
Stephen, that was a fantastic trip through your history and into the future of biomedicine. Let me just ask you a question, one or two questions, and then there are several in the chat. I was very struck by something you were saying very recently in your talk. You almost seem to be implying, and tell me if I'm completely off base, and if not, perhaps expand slightly. You almost seem to be pointing to diagnosis as kind of an intermediate and artificial construct that's getting in the way of going directly from the state that you can observe to some decision about what you can do. It's a fascinating concept. I would love to hear you riff a bit more about that.
Yeah. I mean, look, the point is, if you think there are a finite number of diseases that you can classify, it makes sense to say you've got that disease. This is the thing you should do from that. But increasingly, I think it is empirically clear that that's not really how things work. And we can see from these computational models that's not how we expect things to work. Instead, we expect that there'll just be this sort of infinite collection of possible things that can happen. And yes, one will be able to have some overall classification, but the thing that is going to be more powerful is to say, given sort of the computational mechanism of what's happening, how should you then intervene in that system to make it do the better thing, so to speak? And I think it's I kind of view it a little bit like the financial case. Okay, so people say, that there's, rather than giving some cut and dried sort of analysis of there's this thing wrong with your portfolio, people will say, tweak it in this way, and this is what will sort of algorithmically happen. It's not something where it's like, this is the diagnosis, now go and do this thing. And I kind of think that's, I kind of see that as being more, at least from my perspective, more sort of the future. And one of the things that will both drive that, this availability of just boatloads of data. Obviously right now we have all of the external sort of personal health monitoring kinds of things, but as soon as we have successful, whether it's Raman spectroscopy or something else, as soon as we have successful, potentially non-invasive, detailed measurements of blood levels of all kinds of things, there'll be just vastly more data available. And then a question will be, what on earth does one do with that? And does one say, let's take all of that data, gigabytes of data, and say, okay, the answer is one of 10 things? Or does one take all of that data, which has a lot of rich information in it, and does one essentially directly go from that data through some algorithmic process to figure out then what should one do. And part of the what should one do is, I mean, at this point, again, both at the level of diagnosis and at the level of interventions, there's a pretty discrete set of kinds of things that one expects to do. And, you know, there are obviously many questions about how do you check that nothing bad is going to happen when you have some algorithm that is going to run differently in every person. That's a complicated thing to resolve. Actually, that kind of thing is very reminiscent of a lot of questions about that come up in things like AI ethics. If you have this algorithm and it's running in this way, how do you know it's never going to do anything bad? And that's a difficult problem. It's a problem which most dramatically, I think, has surfaced in modern times with things like content ranking in social media and search engines. It's like those are AIs that are basically doing that content ranking, and people say, oh, I don't like the results. Well, how do you characterize what you actually want to have happen? That's a difficult thing. Actually, our sort of computational language idea plays into that, because in a sense, you want to write a code of ethics, some kind of description of what you want to have happen. And you want to write that in a form that both we humans can understand and computers can understand. So I'm kind of imagining, but I don't know how this will actually play out, that what will happen is there'll be sort of a computational description of this is what should happen in this biomedical situation. These are the things that we want to have happen. Now you basically, rather than saying we do this test and we've got these particular numbers that are coming out, it's like, how does this sort of algorithmic process map into this essentially computational contract that describes what you want to have happen? I mean, it's a somewhat different way of thinking about things. It's a more flexible way of thinking about things than saying we're going to do this clinical trial. We're going to look at these particular one or two numbers and say what comes out of it. And I think that that kind of approach is necessary if one's actually going to achieve sort of genuinely personalized medicine. One's going to have an approach like that, because the idea of doing a trial where you say, we've got this bucket of people who are all kind of similar, does it more or less work well on all those people? That's not really going to, that's not going to be a successful thing if one is actually trying to personalize those outcomes. So that's a few thoughts on that.
So let me ask you to riff on this aspect of what you just said. What's the relationship between the development of these computational models with nearly infinite data inputs as we go forward and the experimentation that needs to happen to confirm them or to even underpin some of their development?
Right. I mean, so one of the challenges is about computation is this. Computation is a very powerful thing. But if you say, I want to be absolutely sure it's going to work this or that way, it's not going to have any bugs, there are going to be no unintended consequences, it's very hard to have both things, to both have the full power of computation and to put computation in such a sort of constrained box that you know it can never do something you didn't expect it to do. So you kind of have this choice. You kind of have a choice of saying, okay, we're going to let computation do its thing, and we're going to or we're going to say we're going to constrain it in such a way that we can see every step of what's going to happen. And I think that, and we're seeing this in AI systems that run lots of things in the world. I mean, increasingly, I mentioned, search engines and social media feeds and so on are two examples that have very real world consequences for kind of, what the AI chooses to do. So now what do you do in that situation? You could say, well, let's just not have any AI picking that stuff. Let's just have a simple algorithm doing that. That really won't work. People won't be very happy with that. It's not making use of the power of computation. So then the question is, what can you actually do? I think the best thing to imagine doing there is to say there are these computational contracts which we insist are respected by the results of those AIs. Now, we can't figure out from scratch about the AI, is this computational contract going to be followed? Because that runs right into computational irreducibility and undecidability and all kinds of issues like that. But so what we have to do in the case of a social media feed is rather straightforward. You're just putting something kind of on the end of that is this computational contract that is deciding the final thing about what to do. It is less clear to me how one implements that idea in the biomedical setting. And it's quite unclear to me, the traditional apparatus of clinical trials and FDA approvals and things like that is really quite quite a different story from the story of what's possible once you kind of let computation have its sort of full power. And I think it's going to be an issue, because I think it's going to be something where, we will have, whether it's, molecular scale computational devices that we can use medically and so on. And then the question is, who can tell whether there will ever be a bug, so to speak, that will cause something bad to happen? That's going to be very hard to know. It's going to be as hard to know, perhaps, as when you actually do medicine and you say, given what I can see about such and such a patient, is anything bad going to happen? There's a certain extent to which you just can't know. And I think the same thing will be true of these kinds of computational systems. And how one thinks about handling that, I'm not yet sure. But I think that's the... you have this choice. You either make use of the power of computation, or you say, I'm going to insist on knowing exactly what's going to happen. I don't think you can have both of those things.
Great. Let me turn you over to the chat, the Q&A session, which is...
All right, let's see what we have here. We've got lots of things here. Let me not address some of the physics questions here. If people are interested in physics questions, I do various kinds of live streams about physics and so on. That's probably the place for that. Anonymous attendee says, Wolfram Language is impressively broad. It seems that computational science have gravitated towards domain-specific packages. I think that's a temporary phenomenon. It's not the right thing. It's something where, we're seeing in the leading edge of R&D in tons of fields, have been using our technology for a long time and achieving remarkable results. I mean, I kind of think the typical experience is, we've built an artifact from the future, and people who use it kind of regularly report their colleagues say, well, we thought one day you'd be able to do something like that, but we thought it would be decades from now, but actually it's now. What's happened when people start from the standard programming languages and add these packages that do this or that thing, the power you get from that is a small fraction of the power that you get from having this kind of integrated idea of a computational language. You built some image processing module, and does it fit together with a graph theory module? No, absolutely not. There's no reason for it to. The thing that I've just spent the last basically 40 years doing is trying to maintain that kind of coherent design for our computational language and have it be the case that across all these different areas, things really fit together. And so that means when you're developing that new machine learning image processing system, you get to immediately make use of all those things where you have to solve differential equations or do computational geometry or whatever else. Those are not things where you have to say, oh, I've got to find this library and this package, and is it going to fit together, and how does that work, and so on. The idea is to have this sort of single integrated system. It's been a lot of work to produce that. I'm happy to say that it's very widely used on the leading edge of lots of fields. I would say that you're right. There are plenty of people who don't use it and should be using it. And that's a problem that we have to solve. And I think one of the things that we've done a lot of work on in recent years is kind of the deployability of our systems, and not only something where you can work interactively in a notebook for kind of R&D purposes, but where you can install that Wolfram engine as an embedded system inside some piece of hardware, or you can run it in the cloud, or you can deploy APIs to it, and so on. And all that stuff is now working rather wonderfully. And the fact that we have this kind of symbolic representation of things, like a symbolic representation of an API, we can just say cloud deploy of this API thing, and you'll immediately have something that's running out there on the web, and so on. These are very powerful things. And I think that's kind of the direction that I see things going. And I have to say, I view it as a bit of a cautionary tale that, I see there as being in the very early days of Wolfram Language, first came out in the form of Mathematica in 1988, nearly a third of a century ago. In the very early days of Wolfram Language, there were a number of, I thought, pretty important ideas. And I would probably about rank number 10 would be the idea of notebooks. And that's the one that 25 years later, people have now sort of widely understood, I think. I think there are 9 others in front of it that are certainly implicitly used all the time by people who use our technology, but have not been widely understood, of which I would say probably that one of the top ones is kind of this notion of symbolic language. So I think it's a funny business that we're in, because we're kind of building, this tower of technology. It's kind of been, for me personally, a kind of an interesting journey going between practical technology and basic science. And I've done this kind of iteration about 5 times. And it's sort of interesting, for example, with our physics project, I thought that's a piece of basic science. It will not have technological applications for 200 years. But in fact, I was wrong. And actually, this whole multi-computation idea is bringing us very practical technological applications really pretty much immediately. And so that's kind of been an interesting process. But it's a strange thing, because we've been kind of building this tower of sort of science and technology from which you can see a long way and do a lot of things. But it's kind of it's a tower that is, I suppose, not it's not as populated as it should be. Let's see. There's a question here about insight frontiers of machine learning for decision support for clinicians. What applications come to mind? Look, the thing to understand about machine learning, I mean, we've been pretty deeply involved in machine learning and neural nets in particular. And the thing to understand is it's a methodology similar to statistical methodologies. It reminds me a great deal of what happened with linear algebra. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, computational linear algebra started to really exist and started to be efficient. People started to build hardware with it. It was a methodology. It enabled things like computer graphics. It enabled lots of kinds of things that we take for granted today. In a sense, neural nets and so on are another methodology. They're sort of a methodology for doing interpolation of functions. And they're a methodology that actually structurally is not that different from linear algebra. And there are things that become possible as a result of sort of doing interpolation of functions and doing it very efficiently that were not possible before. What I think has happened is, starting in basically 2011, 2012, there was this kind of rapid growth of now we can do this stuff. Now it becomes practical to use particularly neural nets and deep learning and so on to do essentially more elaborate kinds of interpolation than we've ever been able to do before. And certain kinds of problems which had been completely inaccessible to computers, like object recognition in images, large-scale object recognition, things like efficiently trainable sort of speech-to-text, things like this, things that had been quite inaccessible suddenly became quite easy. And there's sort of what's happened is there are a series of areas which have kind of been cracked by this kind of notion of sort of sophisticated interpolation that's possible with neural networks. And the issue, I think, now is much more, how do you take the building blocks that exist? How do you take the kind of this idea of sort of neural net interpolation, and how do you wheel it into different kinds of fields? You know, there are places in image processing, image identification, where it works well. There are places in, audio identification where it works well. There are places where you've got large amounts of data and you're trying to sort of pick some pattern out of this data. It may work well, it may not work well. It's hard to tell. It depends on whether many of the places where machine learning has worked well are places where we humans manage to do those things. Not all. I think the protein folding example is an interesting recent example where that wasn't something we humans could do, but we humans can do object recognition quite well. And it's, by the way, not a complete coincidence that the architecture of neural nets is not that different from the architecture of our visual cortex. And both of them are able to do object recognition well. If you present a different kind of problem, some problem from mathematics, for example, neural nets will fail horribly. It's just not what they do. There are certain kinds of things that happen to be easy for humans, weren't doable by computers before, now are doable. I think that one should not expect, and one thing I've seen, we use neural net technology a lot for various kinds of heuristic algorithms and so on. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. What is really an important thing to think about is it okay to get 80% success? If it's okay to get 80% success, this is a good methodology to use. If you care about getting 100% success, it probably isn't. And, so for example, in Wolfram Alpha, we use some neural net technology to kind of speed up, to be able to do, we're just rolling in some technology to do natural language understanding, but we can't actually nail natural language understanding with neural nets. It doesn't work. We can get some percentage success. And so we do that, and we use it to kind of speed up queries because we say we kind of can guess what the answer will be so we can start computing more quickly, those kinds of things. But if we said, let's actually turn our natural language understanding system into one that is purely based on neural nets, it wouldn't work. I mean, at least based on all the experiments we've done, it won't work. So I think it's worth understanding there are certain kinds of applications for which it's a very powerful methodology and others for which it's not. I think, as I say, the frontier right now is what are the general kinds of ways you can use it? So for example, in Wolfram Language, there's just a function called classify, and you just give it examples, training examples, and it will just grind away, and it will use machine learning to optimize the machine learning process. And eventually it will give you a classifier function that you can then use to see results. And so we're now getting a thing where you can do the same kind of thing for elements of an image, for example, where you can say, here are examples of these particular kinds of things you might see in an image. Now be able to create a classifier function that will, or an object recognition function, object detector function that will be able to pick out those things when they appear in an image. So a question you might ask is, okay, so we get a result from a neural net. Why did that answer come out and not another? That's hard to tell, because the internal thinking of a neural net is not something for which we humans can necessarily tell a story. There's no guarantee, just as when we do automated theorem proving in mathematics, for example, we generate this result. It's got 100 steps of complicated mathematical manipulation. It is a machine-generated thing, and no human can understand it. The question of how you go from that to something which is understandable is a different question. So for example, in Wolfram Alpha, where lots of students use our technology all the time, one of the popular features is our step-by-step computation. So, you do an integral and you say, show me the step-by-step version of how that integral was done. Well, the thing to understand is that step-by-step explanation is a total fake. It has nothing to do with how the actual computation was done inside. It has been back constructed for the sake of explaining the story to humans. And in the case of neural nets, for example, there's no guarantee that there is a back construction that explains the result to humans. That's the computation, that's how it came out. Now, there are some things, we actually have a bunch of stuff that's actually in the new version of Wolfram Language that's coming out in a month or two that have a bunch of things that actually have been used by some clinicians in their preliminary form to do a bunch of kind of sort of indicators of kind of what were the important features that led to a particular conclusion from a neural net. But I would say that that's not going to be a full story of kind of explaining how that such and such a conclusion came out.
So, Stephen, we're just at time. So this has been a spectacular 90 minutes. I think the range that you've covered in applications of computation is stunning, and the application to biomedicine extremely thought-provoking for this community. I'm going to point to a few upcoming speakers we have: Michael Creamer, Alina Chan, Amy Abernathy, Todd Golub, Rob Knight, Vinay Prasad, Christina Farr. And I would like once again to thank Stephen Wolfram for spending time with us today and for opening himself up to questions from our community. And I hope Stephen will be able to keep you engaged in thinking about biomedicine and helping to solve those problems and guide us in new directions. Thank you very much.
Thanks.